We are calling our event this afternoon, African Americans Against the Bomb. We are thrilled to have the author of African Americans Against the Bomb, Vincent Intondi, with us as our keynote speaker. And we are proud and excited to be honoring members of Peace Action of Staten Island from the African American community, who are our champions of peace and justice. We will be hearing more about their efforts and accomplishments shortly. At this time, I would like to ask our one of our board members, Mohan, to tell you some more about Peace Action and what we are doing. Mohan?
Good afternoon. Sorry. Sorry.
That's all right.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice of you to join us today. It's one of those events we always have every year in the name of Make Food No War. And this time it is, we wanted to have this topic highlighted here, African Americans Against Bomb, by author Vincent Intondi, who is with us. And just a brief note on Mr. Vincent Intondi. He's an associate professor of history and director of the Institute of Race and Justice and Community Engagement at Montgomery College in Tacoma Park, Maryland. From 2009 to 2017, Intondi was director of research for American University Nuclear Studies Institute of Washington, D.C. His research focuses on the intersection of race and nuclear weapons. We are also honoring at this event our community leaders and activists, Ms. Marjorie Garvin, the official mayor of Staten Island, Ms. Clara Ogburn, Ms. Barbara Walker, Ms. Helen Settles, and Mr. Soji Oluwole. Now I just wanted to share a few words on Peace Action of Staten Island, also known as PASI. You wonder what Peace Action does in Staten Island. I can quickly draw an analogy to explain it in simple terms. Consider us, the Peace Action activists, like your neighbor, who will be there to help, assist, and warn you in anything that happens around your neighborhood. Peace Action activists does the same thing at the national and international level to warn and advocate for peaceful existence in the world, to live in peace and harmony. Peace Action is dedicated to promoting the nonviolent resolution of conflict, the abolition of nuclear weapons, halting the global spread of conventional arms, building a human rights culture, and supporting human needs instead of militarism. We pursue these goals through the production and dissemination of educational materials for the public, activists, and policymakers, as well as through the community organizing initiatives and public outreach. To understand better the role of Peace Action Group, I found it in the bio of our honoree, Barbara Walker. She says it is like encountering daily injustices wrought upon people around the world and doing what we can pressure national and international bodies, pressure for corrective action. Without that, they'll continue on their path of destruction, that there must be some group telling them what is right and what is wrong. I put it in this way. We all know the popular saying, if you see something, say something or do something. Peace Action Group do just that. Not to be quiet where there is a danger lurking around the corner, to put our community, country, and our nation in harm's way, especially the nuclear race that is going on in the world, climate change, wars and upheavals, what is going on in the Middle East and other countries that are chipping away the peaceful existence of many communities and people in the world. If anything we can learn from the recent 2021 United Nations Climatic Change Conference that was held in Glasgow, Scotland, United Kingdom, from October 31st to November 12th, especially former US President Obama, he said that we as parents and community leaders have failed our younger generation. But it is time we should do more to address climate change that is endangering the world. President Obama also said that the younger generation taking more active roles to address the climate change, which you would have seen in the TV all these younger folks are coming out and doing their best. And we hope that we make a good progress. And this progress, we need to address this immediate. This is immediate challenge the world faces for its peaceful existence. Just to conclude my remarks, I urge everyone attending this event to support peace action effort and be an ambassador for this message of peace and coexistence in this universe that we all belong to as humans. Peace doesn't belong to peace activists alone, but peace doesn't belong to peace activists alone, but it belongs to everyone who cares for peace in the world. Together, let us make it happen, as this is our life and our dear future generation, and we want the world to exist as it is, and we continue to understand each other and do the best we can.
Before introducing our guest speaker, Vincent Intondi, I wanted to say a few words about why we chose African Americans Against the Bomb as our theme for today's event. There will be no lasting peace in our world until all nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction are abolished. When the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, African Americans raised their voices loud and clear. They organized. They used the Black Freedom Press to stand against the bomb. They understood the intersectionality of peace and racism, and they would not be silent. Their work goes on. As a peace organization, it is important that we tell the full history of the efforts and accomplishments of our African American brothers and sisters. Their history is to be told, it is to be respected, and it is to be celebrated. And that is what we hope to do today. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Vincent Intondi. Vincent Intondi is a professor of history and the director of the Institute for Race, Justice, and Civic Engagement at Montgomery College in Tacoma Park, Maryland. From 2009 to 2017, Intondi was director of research for American University's Nuclear Studies Institute in Washington, D.C. His research focuses on the intersection of race and nuclear weapons. Welcome, Vincent. We look forward to hearing from you today.
Thank you so much. Everybody can hear me okay, I presume? Everybody can see me. I have 4 large dogs that all promise to be on their best behavior, so I apologize to hear them, but they should be okay up there. And yes, I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., but I was born and raised in Syracuse, New York. So upstate New York is still home for me. So my research focuses on the intersection of race and nuclear weapons, as you heard in the introduction. And when you look at this issue, I don't think that you can separate race from nuclear weapons. I think they're inextricably linked. And when we look at part of the reason that I went down this path is, as somebody that teaches African American history and U.S. history, somebody who's been an activist as well on issues of race and nuclear weapons my whole life. When we think of African American history specifically, so much of it we still don't know, because for so long, the history, the narrative in this country has been written from a rich, white, racist male point of view. And it really wasn't until the late 1960s when you had the Black Arts movement and the Black Studies movement. It wasn't until you had people like Amiri Baraka and Sonia Sanchez and Nikki Giovanni and Gil Scott-Heron and so many others that were demanding that courses be taught from their point of view. And it's when we see the rise of Chicano studies and Native American studies and Latin American studies and Africana studies. And so when it comes to African American history, there is still a giant brick wall in which we are filling in that narrative. And so when you look at the issue of nuclear weapons, I saw a giant brick that was missing in this narrative. Because what we like to do, especially with African American history, is have, compartmentalize it. You have Rosa Parks and you have Dr. King and their nice, neat, categorical little boxes in the textbook, and you have February comes and we're going to cover what's safe, and that's the end of it, right? Instead of looking at anything else. And so when I started this research, and part of why I started it was nuclear weapons was not on my radar. Like most young kids, I felt it was very abstract. Nobody would be crazy enough to use them. I was worried about police brutality and criminal justice reform and things of this nature. And in 2005, I made my first trip to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and met with atomic bomb survivors and visited the museums and was special guests of the ceremonies. And I was filled with so much guilt and rage and anger about what my country had done that when I came back, I remember talking to other professors and mentors about how do I go about eliminating racism and nuclear weapons. And so I started with just asking one basic question, which is, what did African Americans think about dropping the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And many argued that I wouldn't find much of a response, understandably, that African Americans were too busy trying to gain their own freedom and equality, and they didn't have time for this, which would have made sense. But they were actually wrong. And so one of the first stories that I found that kind of kicked off my research involved Malcolm X. And it was in June of 1964. I write about it in the book. In June of 1964, there was a group of atomic bomb survivors and peace activists that were traveling around the world on a peace study mission. When they came to the United States, the woman that organized their event was Yuri Kachiyama, the amazing Japanese-American activist that we lost not too long ago. Someone who was very good friends with Malcolm X, was actually there at the Autobahn when he died, when he was assassinated. And so she asked the atomic bomb survivors, when you're in the United States, what is it that you want to do most when you're here? And they all said, meet Malcolm X. But Malcolm at the time was traveling to Africa and the Middle East. And so she wrote him letters thinking that he probably didn't get any of them. And the last day she was having a reception for them in her apartment in Harlem. And there was a knock at the door. When she opened the door, there was Malcolm X. And he said to the atomic bomb survivors, you've been scarred by the atomic bomb, but we've been scarred too by a bomb. And that bomb is racism. And he spent the day with them talking about how colonialism and the Vietnam War, and nuclear weapons and racism were all connected, because he understood what so many before him understood, that the issue wasn't about civil rights, it was about universal human rights. And so that's where my research started off. And so this book looks at those African Americans who consistently argued that the Black freedom movement in the United States was inextricably linked to nuclear disarmament and liberation movements around the world. When the US dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, instantly killing hundreds of thousands of people, most of America rejoiced. In fact, Gallup ran a poll a week after the atomic bombings that showed that 85% of the American people agreed with Truman's decision to use nuclear weapons. Another poll, Roper poll, in that same week showed that 22% of the American public wished that Japan hadn't surrendered so we could have dropped more nuclear weapons and killed more people. And no poll up until late October of 1945 ever showed more than 4.5% of the American people criticizing Truman's decision. But that wasn't the case in the Black community. And now, of course, nothing is monolithic. We're not saying that every person in the Black community thought the same. But whether it was artists or journalists or pastors or just ordinary individuals, they were questioning and speaking out and protesting against Truman's decision to use nuclear weapons. Now, why did the US, the majority of the American public, agree so much? Well, because during this time, there was a genocidal race hatred against the people of Japan that is unprecedented in our nature's history. Worse than even the racism that we saw towards people of Middle Eastern descent after 9/11. And we're very careful not to do this with other groups of people during World War II. We separate Nazis from Germans, fascists from Italians, but not when Pearl Harbor happened, all of Japan was guilty. In fact, the motto of the Marines at the time was, quote, "Remember Pearl Harbor, keep them dying." General Joseph Stilwell wrote to his wife, quote, "When I think of how these bow-legged cockroaches have ruined our calm lives, it makes me want to wrap Jap guts around every lamppost in Asia." And so all of the depictions of the Japanese were of yellow monkeys and vermin and roaches. And why? Because if you reduce a group of people to being less than human, then of course it makes it easier to commit violence against them. And we've done this dating all the way back to slavery, right? When we wanted to justify our capitalist economic slave system, we had to justify that. So we start saying that Africans now are less than human, right? That they're biologically inferior, that they're uncivilized, that they are not Christian. Later in our Constitution, that they're only 3/5 of a human being, right? So we can justify the behavior that we are now doing for our system. When we do this now with undocumented immigrants, and we refer to them, when we make that jump and now refer to them as aliens, they are no longer human. So it makes it easier to say, kill them all on the border, or hit them with drones, or electrocute them on the fence, or put children in cages, because they're not actual children. They're something other than that. They're less than human. Look at the Middle East. What images do they show us? They show us mothers and fathers and sons of daughters? No. They show us the most bombastic image they can find. Somebody screaming Allah Akbar, and they don't look like us or smell like us or talk like us or act like us. So the translation is not actually human. And this was no different than what we did after Pearl Harbor in Japan. But that wasn't the case in the Black community. Because in the Black community, before the bomb was ever dropped, and before Pearl Harbor even happened, there was an affinity already built in many parts of the Black community. And what I mean is people like W.E.B. Du Bois had already been traveling to Asia and written about Asia, and he was lionized in various countries over there. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, and there were many pro-Ethiopian groups in the United States, it wasn't the United States. It was Japan who publicly came out and said, we were going to come to the aid of our colored brothers and sisters in Ethiopia. And people knew that here. When Japanese internment happened, there were many in the Black community that said, here's a group of people that committed no crime, are being put in these cages because of the color of their skin. This could happen to us. And they start sneaking food and medicine into the concentration camps for the Japanese people. So even if you look at groups like the Nation of Islam, they still refer to themselves as, quote, the Asiatic Black man, and feel there's a connection between Asia and Africa. So some of these connections were already built in. And after the bomb was dropped, the first bomb was dropped on August 6th, 3 days later, August 9th in Nagasaki. For the initial reaction, I did start looking at the Black press, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Baltimore Afro-American. And not only did I find a common thread with the columnists and the opinion writers criticizing Truman's decision, but then I would also look at the rank and file people that I could find, letters to the editor. And it didn't matter if it was beauty shop owners or truck drivers or machine operators. They were all saying the same thing, that this genie had been let out of the bottle, that it was the wrong thing to do. I found the same thing when I started going through sermons of Black pastors in different Black churches throughout the country. I would see the same type of thing, a very apocalyptic narrative that there may not be enough religion or praying we can do to stop this evil that was let out. But of all the initial criticism, the first one to really come out and challenge Truman's own racism in this decision was Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes wrote in the Chicago Defender early on and asked, why did we not drop it on Germany? Why did we not drop it on Italy? Right? Why are people of color in Japan? And Langston was certainly right to do so. Truman wasn't the most racist president we ever had. We probably just got done with that for the last 4 years, but certainly one of the most racist. Truman is somebody that if you go through his diaries or his letters to his wife, Bess, he rarely ever refers to African Americans as anything other than the N-word. He admits in one letter to his wife that yellow people should be in Asia, black people in Africa, and white people in Europe and America, and that he admits he has race prejudice. He brags in interviews that in his family, when you got married, you got slaves as wedding presents to start out the housekeeping with. His mother openly supported the Confederacy, and when she first visited him at the White House, said she'd rather sleep on the floor than ever step foot in Lincoln's bedroom. And he actually at one point sent a $10 check to the Ku Klux Klan to join, but they sent it back to him because he refused to fire Catholic workers in one of his businesses in Missouri. So there's no question that Truman had his own deep-seated racism. How much of that racism played a decision to use the bomb in Japan is still debated to this day. And then I found a letter that Zora Neale Hurston wrote to her friend Claude Barnett. And Zora Neale Hurston is known as pretty apolitical throughout her life. But in this issue, in this instance, she actually refers to Truman as, quote, the butcher of Asia, and is visibly upset that more of the community are not doing stuff to stand up against nuclear weapons. But of that first initial wave of criticism, clearly the most outspoken were the Black Popular Front. Those like W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson. Du Bois likened Truman to Hitler, calling him one of the greatest killers of our day. He had said what was done in Japan was going to set back the progress of colored nations for decades to come. And Paul Robeson, who is so tragic that so many of my students have never even heard his name, this brilliant individual, whether it was athletics, whether it was academics, whether it was Broadway, singing, activism, it just goes on and on how brilliant this individual was. Paul Robeson, in 1946, was speaking at Madison Square Garden, thousands, 20,000 people there, and he goes right after the colonialism issue. And he asked the crowd, where do you think the United States is getting the uranium to build nuclear weapons? And the answer, of course, was the Belgian-controlled Congo. And so we saw how these things were all connected. But many of this initial wave of criticism goes silent in the late 1940s and early 50s with the Truman Doctrine and the rise of HUAC and McCarthyism. Long before George W. Bush ever said it, it was Truman who put that line in the sand and said, you're either with us or against us. And if you were not with Truman and you were not with the US, then you were labeled a communist. And so one of the worst labels that you could have was to be considered black and red in this country in the late 40s and early 50s. And so there were many groups, people that had their lives destroyed, people that there was real consequences to speak out on this issue. And in fact, a group like the NAACP made the conscious decision at this time to take a sharp turn to the right, to ally themselves with Truman, to kick out Du Bois from their own organization he helped found, and to not go against nuclear weapons in hopes that they were going to get some sort of civil rights legislation, which of course never comes true. But not everybody looked at peace and looked at nuclear disarmament as a bargaining chip. And so at the same time as this was happening, there was another peace movement coming out of the communist bloc nations. And out of this came what's known as the Stockholm Peace Pledge, or the Ban the Bomb petition. And so Du Bois and Robeson and so many others, they brought that petition back to the United States and tried to start gathering signatures to ban the bomb, because they saw that we were now thinking about using and threatening to use nuclear weapons in Korea, another people of color. And Du Bois and Robeson said, we're not going to let that happen. And at this point, the arms race is truly on. Because remember, the Russians get the bomb in 49. We developed the hydrogen bomb in 52. They get it in 53. And now the arms race is on. And so, you know, when I talk to my students today and I tell them about the Ban the Bomb petition, they give it a shrug. Now they can just go on change.org and the comforts of their home on their phones, and they're one click and they've signed a petition, and now they can call themselves an activist. But that wasn't the way it was back then. You guys know how it was when you were real consequences in signing petitions like this. People were deported. They were physically beaten. They were put in jail. They lost their jobs. So this wasn't just a symbolic act. And on the heels of the civil rights movement in the early 1950s, to get over 2.5 million votes, largely from the Black community, people like Charlie Parker and Marian Anderson and Duke Ellington signing this petition, 60 million people worldwide. It's extraordinary. And so in the 1950s, especially in the mid-50s, there's so many things that start to come together to really show how these things are connected. And a pivotal year is 1955, because in 1955, in the summer of 1955, you have the heinous murder of Emmett Till. And a few months later, in December of 55, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on the bus. But in that same year, in 1955, you also had the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, the first all-African Asian conference. And there were many here that sent their regards or even attended. And if you look at the platform of the Bandung Conference, it's very clear that they were fighting against white supremacy, they were fighting for nuclear disarmament, and they were fighting for anti-colonialism movements. And so as this was happening in the late 1950s, the Algerian War for Independence is happening. And Ghana is getting their independence, and Nkrumah is rising to power. And at the same time, the French government says they wanted to be a nuclear power and test their first nuclear weapon. And where? In the Sahara, in Africa. And the people in Ghana feared what the fallout would do to the cocoa industry that was so precious to them in Ghana. And there was one individual that was here and saw all of these developments happening with civil rights here and freedom movements around the world and nuclear weapons. And that was the great Bayard Rustin. Again, another person that my students have never heard of because he was gay. And so he is marginalized and iced out of so much of the civil rights movement history. And yet this was arguably one of the greatest organizers of the civil rights movement. His activism dates back to the 1930s, and you wouldn't have had a March on Washington without Bayard Rustin. And so Rustin puts this team together of activists from the UK and with Nkrumah and Ghana, and he goes to Africa. And these activists physically put their bodies on the line to try to stop the French tests. And eventually the French physically remove them and they test their nuclear weapon, but it launches protests around the continent. And it inspires Nkrumah to have follow-up World Without the Bomb conferences and actions to speak out against nuclear weapons. And not everybody was in favor of this. A. Philip Randolph, who was here working in the civil rights movement, he writes to Rustin in Africa and says, "What are you doing over there? We need you over here to work on the primaries and Kennedy and things of this nature." And Rustin writes back and says, "Don't you see what I'm doing, how these things are connected? This is the most important work I could be doing." And even to the day he died, Rustin said that that was the most important thing he ever thought that he actually did, was working on this, on the Sahara Project. And so I can't talk about, of course, the civil rights movement or the Black freedom movement in this issue without looking at Dr. King. Dr. King, we like to say that his entrance into foreign policy in the United States was literally a year to the day he died. On April 4th, 1967, a year to the day he died, when he was in Riverside Church, and he gives his now famous Beyond Vietnam speech where he refers to the United States as, quote, "the greatest purveyor of violence in the world," a stinging indictment on US foreign policy. But actually, if you look at nuclear disarmament, King was speaking about it a full decade earlier in 1957. That's when he made his first public comments speaking out against nuclear weapons. And he would say, what does it matter if we're worried about integrating lunch counters and then not be worried about the world in which we're trying to integrate? That makes no sense, right? What does it matter if we achieve all this social justice, but we're dead from nuclear war? How can you not see that, right? He talks about the triple evils of militarism and capitalism and racism and how these things are connected. And where did King get this inspiration from? His wife, Coretta Scott King. Coretta was a long seasoned activist dating back to her days at Antioch College. She was a member of Women's Strike for Peace and Women's International League of Peace and Freedom. And she certainly wasn't the only one. There were many Black women who were at the forefront of this fight. DuBois' wife, Paul Robeson's wife, Slanda, they were all in the forefront of this. But the problem for a lot of the Black women involved in this fight was that they were dealing with racism within the peace organizations. And so for Women's Strike for Peace, I read about, there was a conference in Detroit in which a national conference, and the Black women wanted to have signs there that said desegregation or disintegration. And the white members said, no, they didn't want to tie race into this. And it was Coretta who had to broker the deal on things like that. And then you had people like Lorraine Hansberry. Lorraine Hansberry is so well known for Raisin in the Sun, but my God, she's so much more than that. A feminist, a socialist, an anti-nuclear activist. Fabulous book that just came out on her called Radical Vision that really explores all the pieces we forget or ignore about Lorraine Hansberry. She famously goes into a theater and sees a film on Hiroshima and comes out and says, no more Hiroshimas, not now, not ever. The last play that she ever wrote was about a nuclear holocaust and what happens to the 2 lone survivors and how we deal with that. So there's so much more to these individuals than we like to actually talk about or see. And if you look through the 1960s, of course, we threatened to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam, again on a people of color. And groups like the Black Panther Party, If you go and you look at executive mandate number 1, read by Bobby Seale in 1967 at the Sacramento courthouse, he explicitly ties the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to the Black freedom struggle in the United States. And I asked Bobby if that was intentional. And he said, of course it was. We always saw ourselves in an international context, which is why people like Kathleen Cleaver and Eldridge Cleaver were invited to speak in Hiroshima and in Japan and talk about these issues in Black periodicals. And, you know, you see this in the 70s, but it really comes to fruition in the 1980s. You know, in the 1970s, in the 1960s, you had so many people at the end of the Vietnam War movement and the Civil Rights movement and Stonewall and so many other things happening where people were exhausted, right? You know, people had PTSD. People had to go underground, leave the country, were in jail. And so there was a struggle to kind of revive these movements. And I can tell you in one word what revived the movement for nuclear disarmament in the 1980s. Reagan. When Reagan came in, he announced that he was going to increase military spending, especially for nuclear weapons, by $180 billion, while cutting social spending for the poor by $140 billion. And a lot of those programs really hurt the Black poor communities. And this got them to rise up and say, no, this economics doesn't add up. We need to fight back on this. Old groups like SANE and others started, and Union for Concerned Scientists and Physicians for Social Responsibilities found new life in the 1980s. And you saw it coming from all directions. You know, I remember when I was writing this book, I was also writing for the Huffington Post about some of these issues. And I got a phone call from a gentleman. He said, I know what you're working on. I got to meet with you. And so we met together, African-American gentleman, and his name was Greg Johnson. He's in the book. And he says that, you know, at the time in the early 80s, he was a librarian at Georgetown, and him and his wife were very interested in this issue. And they went to the white pacifists, the white peace groups, and said they wanted to be part of this. But nobody took them seriously. They said, nah, nobody in your community cares about this. And so the two of them, with a rotary phone and one flyer, started a group called Blacks Against Nukes. And it grew to hundreds of members in multiple chapters, and they spoke in Hiroshima and were featured in Jet and in Essence. And here were two ordinary people doing something extraordinary, right? And, you know, I love to see the rise again of a socially conscious athlete. You know, whether it's Trayvon Martin's death making, you know, and LeBron and James and Dwayne Wade and so many others throwing their hoodies up in protest. Of course, Colin Kaepernick and Michael Bennett and so many others. And when we think of the socially conscious athlete, we automatically think of the '68 Olympics, right? With John Carlos and Tommy Smith putting their fist up in the air. We think of Muhammad Ali, of course, right? So many others. But there were also other athletes in the 1980s that were fighting for nuclear disarmament. And they were called Athletes United for Peace. Professional athletes in this country working with Russian athletes, many of them African American. I saw this, you know, when we had Veterans Day, somebody tweeting about Jojo White from the Boston Celtics and his military service. Jojo White was also in Athletes United for Peace and spoke for nuclear disarmament. People like Marianne Washington, the first African-American woman on the Olympic basketball team, who also spoke out against this issue. The whole Baltimore Orioles baseball team went to Hiroshima. So again, you see it coming from different places throughout the 1980s. And it all really comes together with the now famous June 12th, 1982 rally in Central Park, the largest single rally for anything in United States history, the single largest rally for nuclear disarmament in world history, in which over 1 million people came together. And the thing about this rally, what is so missed, is how diverse it was. You know, again, we like to think this was just a white middle class issue, and it wasn't. In fact, 50% of the leadership that day was African American, led by the great Herbert Daughtry, the Reverend Herbert Daughtry, and the Black United Front. You had people like Ozzie Davis and Ruby Dee and Coretta Scott King and Shaka Khan and the Wailers and Rita Marley and Richie Havens. I could go on and on of how many Black performers and poets and speakers there were at this event. Thousands of African Americans pouring out of Bed-Stuy in Harlem, speaking out against nuclear weapons. It was an incredible moment that did, in fact, influence the Reagan administration to change their stance on nuclear weapons. And the hardest part for me in writing this book was tackling President Obama, because the book came out in 2015, and at the time he was still president. And I knew I was going to have to write about him, but as a historian, the worst thing I want to do is predict something and then be wrong, and then it's there for life, right? So I had to kind of tread lightly on this one. And so President Obama, as a student at Columbia, wrote about nuclear disarmament and nuclear issues. He reported on the June 12th rally. And as he went into his political career, constantly talked about this issue. But one thing to remember is he certainly wasn't the first. For a very long time, the leaders on nuclear disarmament in Congress was the Congressional Black Caucus. People like Shirley Chisholm, most notably Ron Dellums. Ron Dellums out of California. He was the head of the Foreign Relations Committee. Ron Dellums was so influential when Ronald Reagan announced he was going to build the MX missile and headquarter in Utah. It was Dellums who went to Utah to meet with Spencer Kimball, the head of the Mormon Church, to come out publicly and say he didn't want Reagan's missile program there. When you look at the 84 and 88 primaries, when Jesse Jackson ran for president, his platforms both years were much more anti-nuclear than any sitting Democrat, and he got millions of votes. Obama's hero, Harold Washington, first Black mayor of Chicago, won multiple awards for his work in the field of nuclear disarmament. So there is a history here of Black politicians speaking out and working against this, working for nuclear disarmament. And when Obama becomes president, a few months after his inauguration in April, he gives now the famous Prague speech, which the Prague speech was arguably the most anti-nuclear speech any president has ever given, with possibly the exception of President John F. Kennedy's commencement address at American University in June of 1963, dubbed the Peace Speech. And after that, President Obama signed the New START Treaty. He also brought together world leaders to start collecting loose nuclear weapons making materials to get them out in safe hands. And that was incredibly effective. In fact, he got enough materials to make 4 nuclear weapons out of the Ukraine before Ukraine fell into disarray. And I remember I would always go to take students to Hiroshima and Nagasaki every year with American University. And I remember the first year I went when Obama had become president. It was the first time that he allowed, or any president allowed, for a United States ambassador to attend the August 6th ceremony. It was Ambassador Ruse at the time. And Mayor Akiba, at the time, the mayor of Hiroshima, he started a campaign calling it the Obama-jority. And I was watching all of these thousands of Japanese people wearing Obama-jority t-shirts that day. And Japanese citizens were coming up to me, and when they heard I was American, they were handing me stacks of letters and saying, "Can you please send these to your president and thank him for what he's doing?" And it was the first time in all the years I had gone there that I was proud of who my president was. And then Obama continued on this path in which the most important thing I think he did, bar none as president, is the Iran nuclear deal, in which, without firing a shot, got Iran to stop building a nuclear weapon, which of course Trump trashed when he came into office. And symbolically, I think it was incredibly important that Obama visited Hiroshima as the first sitting president to visit. I won't ever forget at 4 a.m. being up on the time difference and being on Skype with atomic bomb survivors and crying, seeing my president at the actual, Peace Park and talking about this issue. Now, does that mean Obama did everything I wanted? Of course not. He still signed on to the $1 trillion modernization plan. He never took nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert. He never went for no first use. He certainly could have eliminated more nuclear weapons than that I would have liked. But I don't put that on him. I put it on us, because Obama never said, "Yes, I can." He said, "Yes, we can." And if we wanted him to do that, then we should have been 1 million strong in the streets, making him do what we wanted him to do, right? And so what can we learn from all this? Well, I'll be honest with you, that as somebody who's fought so much in my life to eliminate racism and eliminate nuclear weapons, and for the last 4 years have a white supremacist fascist dictator with our nuclear weapon arsenal in his hand, to have, really, if you look at Putin included, 2 white nationalist dictators with 90% of the world's nuclear arsenals in our hand, it made me feel defeated, that if I was failing. But I made a promise long ago to the Hibakusha, to the atomic bomb survivors, that I would never stop fighting on this front. And so, yes, we need to constantly work on making sure Black lives matter, and that women are treated equal in the society, and that undocumented immigrants are treated equally in the society. All of these things, of course, these social justice issues matter. But again, what does it matter if we're all dead from nuclear war? And I know that there will still be nuclear weapons and racism on this planet when I leave. But if there's just a few less nuclear weapons and a little bit less racism when I leave this planet than when I came into it, then that's all I can do. And so our movement is not about the present. Our true impact, the impact of what you're all doing, will not be felt for generations. But that is not a reason to fall into despair. That is a reason to keep fighting. And if you look now, you look at the juxtaposition between Putin and Trump, and then on the other side, during that same time period, you had over 120 nations, mostly from the global south, mostly people of color, who signed, ratified, and entered into force a nuclear weapons ban treaty at the UN. If you want to see the difference in how this connects to race, right? To see these people saying, no, we're not going to work with you financially, no testing, no production, none of it. And when people say, well, it doesn't matter because the nuclear powers aren't part of it, well, there was a time when chemical weapons were the norm, and they're not. There was a time when landmines were widely used, and they're not. And so this nuclear weapons ban treaty is a tool to shame and to tweak and to make better and to work towards eliminating nuclear weapons. And to dismiss it because the nuclear powers aren't privy to it or aren't part of it is so condescending, so dismissive of other countries that maybe don't have the economic power of the West. And so King would often say that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But as I close here, I would argue, not unless we all actually bend it. Thank you.
Vincent, thank you very much. Thank you for telling us about the history, for encouraging us, for inspiring us. And, I think you've really, you've just made the point that we cannot quit. We cannot quit, and we cannot think that we will accomplish everything in our lifetime, but the accomplishments that we make, we build so that the people after us, the people that follow, will continue the work. And we thank you so very much for what you're doing. And just so wonderful to have you here today. Thank you.
And again, any questions, fire away. I'm here.
Do we have some questions? I know I saw some come up in the chat. Do we have Sally or Joanna? Can you handle that?
If there are questions, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
We had one question. Somebody wanted to know the title of the Lorraine Hansberry book.
Yeah, I see it's already in the chat, and that is the correct title. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Great book.
How can we make, Joanne, how can we make Black Americans today more committed to nuclear abolition? They don't seem to understand what it does, how it impacts on their everyday life. They don't understand that. How can we make them better understand it?
So there's a couple things. There's not going to be one magic campaign to do that. The things that I see in my experience, and I work with trying to get more diverse voices in this movement all the time. One thing is, oftentimes those in the disarmament and peace community talk at the Black community. Big problem. I cannot tell one of my Black students today that nuclear weapons is the biggest existential threat of their life. It's not. The most existential threat of their life is getting killed by the police on the way to class, on the way to school. So you have to meet them where they are. And so when you have kids that are saying, I'm working 2 jobs and I have student loans and I'm trying to put food on the table, trying not to get killed by the cops. Oh, and by the way, you want me to stop nuclear war? How am I supposed to do that? Right? So you have to find different ways in, and you have to find, like Joanne said, how are they connected? So, I tell a story a lot about a couple of years ago when in Baltimore, they were asking the public school students, the parents, to bring in space heaters because they had no heat in their classrooms. And for me then to be able to talk to parents, many of whom were African American, and explain to them that we're going to spend $1 trillion on nuclear weapons, and they don't have heat for your kids, and not see how these things are related, right? Then they start to see, okay, I have a stake in this game. When they realize where the money is being spent in terms of pensions and in terms of retirement funds in their schools, that's another way. When you think of, maybe for another time, I have reached kids with music, you know, whether it's hip hop artists like Doom, or whether I'm reaching them with Gil Scott-Heron and his music, or I'm reaching them with different artists, then I can reach kids that way. Some I'm reaching them through sports. Some I'm reaching them through their religion. So there's not one way, there's not this one magic, you know, sample that you're going to reach everybody and how they think about this. Now, the other problem is what we tend to do in our schools. Well, number one in history is, again, we silo everything, right? And so they don't even learn about any of this stuff. My kids, black or white, have no idea about this till they even get to college, which is ridiculous. But the other thing is, what we often do is we segregate STEM issues from humanities, which is the wrong approach, right? They should be combined. Look at the geniuses of our world, from Einstein to Steve Jobs to Da Vinci. They all realized that art and humanities and science were connected. They were involved in both. And so our kids should be studying African American history and nuclear issues throughout their careers, right? If you're taking physics classes, you should have classes on philosophy and history and these types of things. Why are we siloing all of this? And so that's another way that we should be doing things much earlier on in schools and reaching them. So there's, you know, when we think about where, if a nuclear weapon went off, it was dropped in our country, where in terms of populations in urban areas and cities, how many people would be affected, right? When you teach them about the history of Black veterans being used as guinea pigs, when we talk to them, you know, and the other big thing is, for so long, there was a real affinity or a real connection, a Pan-Africanist connection in our history, right? You know, when I teach my kids, most of my classes we're the most diverse school in the continental United States. And most of my classes are 50% African from all various parts of the continent, 49% African American, and 1% other. And when I teach my African American history classes, honest to God, I will have kids the first day that will say, I'm not African, I'm from Southeast DC. I'm from Anacostia, don't call me African, I'm not one of them. And then all my African kids say, don't call me African American. I'm told not to even talk with them. They droop their pants, they're lazy, they don't work hard. And then my Ethiopian kids will say, don't call me West African, we're kings and queens, we were never colonized. And then I have to say, but wait, when a cop is stopping and beating your ass, does he stop first and say, wait, are you from Cameroon or Southeast? Or is he just beating you because you're Black? And I watch as this semester goes on, as they refer to themselves as them and they, by the end of the semester, they start saying we. And so whether it was, you know, Martin Delaney, whether it was Marcus Garvey with the red, black, and green flag and Pan-Africanism and talking about a God of Ethiopia, whether it was, you know, the 1960s when you had the cultural arts movement, when you had these artists, even the golden era of hip hop in the 1980s with the African medallions, when you had African Bambaataa and Zulu Nation, and you had Poor Righteous Teachers and BDP and all these folks, there was a connection about people of color around the world being connected. And I don't know how strong that is today as it used to be. On the Palestine issue, absolutely. But the more that kids can realize that what happens, you know, that old saying, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And the more they can realize that what happens in the Marshall Islands, and what happens to Native Americans, and what happens in the Congo, and what happens in African American places, that it's all the same fight. Right? That you're all being colonized and it's all the same fight against people of color, then you'll start to, you know, this is an issue you can see that you could put at the center and then pivot around it. So there's a lot of different ways that, you know, you can get African Americans or just younger kids that maybe don't care about this issue, but, you know, we got to think outside the box, and we got to think of how, you know, that's one of the reasons why I wrote the June 12th book, because I wanted to learn, what did they do right and wrong? How did they pull this off in the 1980s and get so many people involved in it? You know, what can we learn from that? And so from the nuclear freeze initiatives and things like that. So those are some of the ways that I think, you know, we can work towards and, you know, be better at.
It's not just the students, it's bougie Blacks, and, to be honest, or Black people who are well educated who don't make that connection either.
Right. And, you know, the other thing is you also have to think of what region of the country you're in. You know, I remember giving a talk in Syracuse, New York years ago and talking about this issue. And there were a lot of folks in the crowd that said, we're with you. We don't like nuclear weapons, but the main employer in my town is Lockheed Martin. That's where my job is. And so find me another job and I'll be more than happy to quit. And so that congressman also is going to back that, because again, that's where, you know, they're hiring them and bringing jobs in. So that's the other piece that you got to think of getting people in.
Okay, I think we have a question, time maybe for 2 more questions. We have,
It's you know, the other thing too, it's hard because when you think of like climate change and why has climate change got momentum, part of that is because climate change, they knew early on that they needed a win. And the win they got was Keystone Pipeline. Now they knew that Keystone Pipeline wasn't the be all end all and that was going to end climate change, but it's tangible. It's something that kids and other people that weren't really invested in, they could get behind and they could fight and they could say, we stop this. That's harder to do with nuclear weapons. You start talking about ICBMs and no first use and treaties and forget it, gone, right? You got to work on simplifying it and how you're going to reach them. And again, that's why I think the TPNW was so important for its language and its simplicity. And that's not a knock on it, but that, you know, and that's why the Nuclear Freeze Initiative was so successful because of its language.
okay. So do we have any more questions?
I may. Do you hear me?
I'm sorry?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned that Reagan was a big jolt to the movement, and I do agree with that. The other part of it was Thatcher, actually. But do you also explain the later decline in the anti-nuclear movement? I mean, the decline in the support for European nuclear disarmament and CND, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. There was a visible decline, of course. And also during Obama years, as Medea Benjamin comments, the era, I mean, she said that Obama sucked the air out of the sail or whatever, the flag of the anti-war movement. So do you have comments on those? Sure.
So certainly there was, you know, again, especially in the 1980s, going into the 1990s, there is this kind of petering out now of the nuclear disarmament movement across the board. I also think that we should give a lion's share of the credit in terms of any progress in the 80s to Gorbachev. We all know that, you know, at that golden hour when Gorbachev and Reagan were together, and it was Gorbachev who was ready to eliminate all nuclear weapons, only asking for a 10-year halt on testing of this ridiculous Star Wars program, and Reagan refused to do that. And so the INF Treaty was kind of the piece after that. So let's not forget his visionary leadership. And as far as Obama goes, yes, the reality is Obama was a very tough one for those of us who are very progressive or on the left to deal with. I mean, I will admit it myself that, you know, there were many times where I even had to check myself and admit I was maybe being hypocritical, because I would say, wait a minute, if this was another president, would I be out there protesting right now? But yet I would fall into a defense because their blatant racism towards this individual, the amount of assassination threats against him and his family were so big that I felt I constantly was in a position of defending him in many ways, because the vitriol and the hatred was so deep on the other side. And I also, you know, think that, again, when you learn more about those Obama years, you know, so the modernization plan, the signing on to the $1 trillion, the problem was losing the supermajority in the House once Ted Kennedy died, because to get even the New START treaty ratified through Congress, the only way you could do it was to agree to Senator Kyle, former senator of Arizona, to agree to the modernization plan. Kyle was holding the votes hostage. So a lot of this stuff you have to look at and say, okay, how far was he doing this, that, and the other? So I don't think, again, I try to be as even-handed as I can in my criticism and both praise of him in the book. But yeah, I think that's a valid question, is, you know, it did kind of take the steam out of like, wait, where are we, you know, in terms of how we are handling him? I think it was a tricky one for a lot of us on the left.
Well, thank you, Vincent. This, you know, sadly, we must draw this. We'll have to conclude, and we hope that you'll come back someday. We would love to hear from you again. And we look forward to hearing about your new book. Good luck with that. Thank you so much for being here, making it very, very special.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. Have a great rest of your day. And again, please feel free to I put my information in there. So please feel free to, any follow-up questions or anything like that, you can just email me.
Thank you, Vincent. Thank you.
In this part of our program, we would like to pay tribute to some special Peace Action of Staten Island members who who we've lost over the years. There are many people that we need to acknowledge, but we wanted to especially acknowledge these four members today. My name is Sally Jones, and I am grateful to be here to share this with you. The first person is Reverend Lloyd Berg. He died this year. Lloyd was a lifelong member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, FOR, a nonprofit peace and justice organization. He proudly joined the FOR as a teenager and would later work for them as a fundraiser for nearly 20 years. Lloyd was a conscientious objector and lived his life according to his belief in the power of nonviolent action and diplomacy as a way to approach conflict, both interpersonal and political. Lloyd also is a lifelong Staten Islander and went to Wagner College, and many of us will miss him greatly. The next person we'd like to honor is Sam Daniel. We lost him several years ago due to serious illness. Among many other roles Sam Daniel played in his life, a father, a friend, a worker, a believer, Sam was a peace and justice activist. He served on PASI's Speakers Bureau and board for several years, only resigning when he was struck with illness. He thought it was possible for a small group of Liberians and peace activists from Staten Island to stop the violence in Liberia by raising our voices and counseling the U.S. Congress and the United Nations on what needed to be done. We are so grateful for all that we learned from Sam Daniel about the history of Liberia and the importance of speaking and raising our voices. The next person we remember is Sajda Mazawir-Ladner, who we lost this year. I know many of you on the program tonight were close to Sajda. Since the late 1960s, Sajda Mazawir-Ladner served Staten Island as a community enrichment specialist and as executive artistic director of the Universal Temple of the Arts. She was a dedicated peace activist who promoted peace education through arts, dance, and music. Through her efforts, this would be the 32nd year of the Staten Island Jazz Festival. She was honored by Peace Action of Staten Island as a peacemaker in 2016. And she will be sorely, sorely missed. The next person we would like to honor is Elizabeth McCombs, who we lost 4 years ago. Betty McCombs regularly attended and was a welcome presence at Peace Action of Staten Island meetings until she passed away at 86. She was fiercely independent, collected dolls, and never let her medical challenges slow her down. She was an inspiration to all of us of how to stay active to the very end. So thank you for remembering these four members and all the other people who we have lost.
Okay, on to our awards presentations. And our first awardee is Marjorie Garvin. Marjorie, are you there? Is she muted, Sally, maybe, or?
I think
Yes,
that it's
here we
David
are,
Hazard.
here we are.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Marjorie Garvin, here you are.
Yes, I'm here.
The
Yes,
unofficial mayor of Staten Island. In 1955, Marjorie Garvin, a young girl of 15 growing up in Brooklyn, went to the store to pick up the newspaper for her father. On the way home, she read the story of the lynching of Emmett Till. It was the day she determined that Emmett Till's life would not be in vain. She would dedicate herself to bettering the lives of her Black people. Marjorie's story is intertwined with the civil rights struggle of African Americans. In 1963, she attended the March on Washington to lobby for the passage of civil rights legislation, where she heard Dr. Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech. She joined the Selma March in Alabama in 1965 to protest discriminatory voter registration policies practiced in the state. In the early 1980s, Marjorie was arrested for civil disobedience while she was advocating for tenants' rights. She volunteered with both Jesse Jackson's presidential campaigns in 1984 and 1988. After Amadou Diallo was gunned down by police in his own home without cause in the Bronx in 1999, she joined the thousands of marchers who marched across the Brooklyn Bridge with Reverend Al Sharpton. She also helped organize and lead a march on Staten Island on Mother's Day in 2000. Marjorie went back to Washington to lobby for gun control legislation with the Million Man March. In 2012, Marjorie was named Staten Island Woman of Achievement, and in September 2016, she was interviewed by Amanda Farinacci and featured on New York One as the Staten Islander of the Week. Of all her accomplishments, Margie is most proud of her success, in persuading people to get out and vote. She reminds the young people of Staten Island that children died in the civil rights movement in order that they could have the right to vote. In 2012, Marjorie was named Staten Island Woman of Achievement. Oh, I said that, well, I'll say it again. In 2016, she was interviewed for New York One. Marjorie is a warm, loving person that has an indomitable spirit who challenges everyone to reach beyond themselves. And Marjorie, we are happy to present the Peacemaker Award to you for your lifetime advocacy for civil and voting rights, for your efforts to register young Black voters, and your inspiring commitment to improving the lives of children and families in our community. This Peacemaker Award is presented to you today, Marjorie Garvin. Congratulations. Marjorie, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, I'm very, very happy. My award is beautiful, and I hope God give me another chance to try to get out here and still organize some young men and women about voting, because this year I saw we had a very low turnout. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to be talking to people and try to get the vote out much higher. Mm-hmm. And I thank you all for thinking about me.
Oh, we thank you, Marjorie. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next awardee is Clara Ogburn.
Yeah.
Here we go. Clara Sue Ogburn is a persistent, effective, and unsung heroine of Staten Island activism. A graduate of Port Richmond High School and Long Island University, Clara turned degrees in psychology and sociology into a career at the Psychological Corporation, Harcourt, Brace, Jovanovich, and since 1987 with the Children's Aid Society. During the heady years of the Civil Rights Movement, she was active in the NAACP, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Urban League, and feels blessed by having met with such iconic figures as Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Medgar Evans, and by her participation in voter registration, petitioning, sit-ins, and the March on Washington. Excuse me. She has worked on several political campaigns on Staten Island and served on the board of the Universal Temple of the Arts. She continues to pursue her purpose through active participation in Staten Island chapter of the NAACP, National Council of Negro Women, Peace Action of Staten Island, the Harriet Tubman Purple Hat Society, and the Staten Island Democratic Association. She is strongly committed to the Fellowship Baptist Church, where she has served on various committees for many years. Being an activist, Clara says, is my timely purpose. And for all of your work, Clara Sue Ogburn, you are presented with the Peacemaker Award for your lifetime of volunteering that has built and continues to build community organizations to serve, educate, and agitate for a better, more peaceful world. This Peacemaker Award is presented to you today, Clara Ogburn. Congratulations.
Thank
Say
you.
a few words.
I don't know if I've ever been a person of few words, but I'll try.
Try.
No, I thank Peace Action humbly for their consideration of this. And I get all choked up because I don't like talking about me, because my whole life has been geared around making sure that I don't waste my God-given birth in not fulfilling the purpose for me being created. And that's why I think about service and trying to help and do what I can with individuals and organizations to make this a better world for all of us. You know, I mean, I really am at a loss for words when it gets down to talking about myself, because it's not about me. It's about life and about others and making this world literally a better place for all people. I thoroughly look forward to reading Mr. Intondi's book in its full depth, because it's so inclusive of the vital information about African Americans and other minorities and about human beings in totality. So in conclusion, I say thank you again, Peace Action, and I'll do whatever I can continue to play my part in my commitment to Peace Action. Thank you all. Have a blessed day.
Thank you, Clara.
Thank you, Clara.
Congratulations. Our next awardee is Soji Oluwole. Soji Oluwole is a Sandy Ground descendant with deep local roots combined with a global perspective. He is curious, interested, and concerned about U.S. policy, and understands in a deeply personal way how what is done abroad affects the lives of people. For your work, Soji, the Peacemaker Award is presented to you today for speaking out and taking a strong stand against militarism, injustice, and war, and making the connections to the Black freedom struggle. This Peacemaker Award is presented to you today, Soji. Congratulations. Would you like to say a few words?
Yes, absolutely. I just want to thank everyone in Peace Action of Staten Island for this wonderful award. I'm very grateful to be in the company of the other 4 awardees who have done so much, and they've inspired me to do a lot of the work they continue to do. And I've always been active in organizations through Peace Action, NAACP, SIDA, the National Urban League. I got my first start, about 20 years ago, when I was at the College of Staten Island, speaking up, speaking out against the injustices of all people, but especially communities of color. And I often think what the society would have looked like had it not been for organizations such as the NAACP, Peace Action, feminist groups, other organizations that stand up for marginalized and oppressed people. And now that as an adult and the uncle of 2 beautiful nieces, I often wonder what the society is going to look like for them and the future generations. And I think this is one of the reasons why the white supremacist mindset fears the convergence and the coalescence of Black, Latino, Native American, poor, dispossessed white people coming together and fighting all of these horrible injustices, because they know in the end we will win. I may not be around to see that. My nieces, my grandnephews, grandnieces, they may not be able to see that. But there will be a day when we will have that type of a society. And again, I'm very grateful to my family and friends, especially my parents, who taught me, my brother and sister, not to judge anyone by the color of the skin or what they look like. Is to get to know the person and get to know. And I was always exposed to different cultures growing up. So that often inspired me to continue to do the work. And I will continue to do that until I can't do it anymore. So once again, thank you to Peace Action, and thank you to all the honorees for doing all the work. Thank you for what you've done and you continue to do. And I hope to be half the person that these people are. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Soji. Congratulations. Thank you so much. Our next awardee is Helen Settles. Helen Settles is a retired educator from the Department of Education. She retired in 2009 after 36 years of teaching. She is an executive committee member of the Staten Island NAACP and its civic engagement chairperson. She is the former president of the Staten Island Democratic Association, founding member of the Staten Island Special Olympics programs, and head basketball coach. 2002 Staten Island Advanced Woman of Achievement. She is on the Project Hospitality Board of Directors, as well as the Universal Temple of the Arts Board of Directors. She is an elected member of the Democratic County Committee. She lobbied the mayor and the sanitation commissioner to clean out the sewers on Targee Street between Broad and Van Duzer Street, to cut down on water in the Targee Street residents' basements. She lobbied for City Hall to cut out sidewalks in the Stapleton community so that it would be easier for handicapped and disabled persons to walk or use their handicapped devices. A proud member of the Staten Island Peace Action Committee, the Harriet Tubman Purple Hat Society, the National Council of Negro Women, and Wagner College Alumni Association. Helen says, I am a peace activist and have been involved in peace rallies for many years, and she thanks us for this honor. And for your work, Helen Settles, you are presented with the Peacemaker Award for being a lifetime peace activist while serving the youth of Staten Island as teacher, mentor, and coach, and empowering her community through political education and advocacy. Helen, congratulations. Would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, I had to unmute myself.
Okay.
But anyway, first of all, congratulations to the other awardees, and Thomas Sowry, I will show a copy of the actual award. Thank you very much. I also thank Staten Island Peace Action for giving me this award and the beautiful bouquet of flowers that we received. Also, was very nice. Just basically, since the age of 13, I have been involved in the movement. I remember Pastor Whistle. I used to go to Community Baptist Church in Queens because I grew up in Queens, and he told the pastoral board, he said, I'm taking a busload to Washington D.C., and that was in August 1963. And so I happened to be one of the young people who went on that trip and heard all the speakers, and including Martin Luther King Jr. did the I Have a Dream speech. So from the age of 13, I've always been involved with peaceful activities, marching with the Young Lords and supporting them when they took over Lincoln Hospital in the 60s. Becoming a member of the Black Panther Party with my brother in Jamaica when I was 17, until just, lobbying for peace and working with young people, because I feel that if we can reach the minds of young people who are going to be the leaders of the world when we're long gone. I'm 71 years old, so I don't know if I'm gonna be around that much longer. But the young people, if I can constantly work with young people and inspire them to be successful, just like with Margie, I'm always constantly out there registering young people to vote. I run tournaments, and anyone who turns 18 in my tournament gets a voter registration form. So definitely, and I tell them to get out and vote. I said, change will never happen if you're not part of that change, and you think your vote doesn't count, but it does. And that's what I encourage them to do. It was really funny. Last night I stopped at on Charger Street at a store, and there was these young boys in there, maybe about 4 or 5 of them. And there was a picture of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Mandela, Bob Marley, Barack Obama. So just out of curiosity, I said, who are those gentlemen right there? Who can tell me something about them? Always the teacher, right? So one kid, oh, I know that's Barack Obama, and I know that's Nelson. And one kid, quiet kid, sitting in the corner, he said, that's Malcolm X, Barack Obama, Bob Marley, Nelson Mandela, and Martin Luther King. I said, well, what can you tell me about them? And this young man, he must have, keep up on his history, because he was able to tell me something that the rest of the kids were just looking at him like, how do you know this? So whoever, worked with that young man, or whoever taught that young man, taught him something about his history, which was really good. So when I taught school, I taught history. So naturally, I used to tell the students, I used to say, well, first of all, I used to wear a button, teach the children the truth. Children are to be not only seen, but heard. I used to have that on my door too. Because I said they have something to say. And if we don't listen to them, then it's our loss. But we have to guide them, of course. Being elders, we have to guide them. So that's my mission. As long as I can do it, I'm going to be out there with the young people, encouraging them to do the right thing, always constantly teaching them, talking to them, listening to them, registering them to vote when they turn 18, and tell them that it matters. And so I will continue doing this. I will continue being a peace activist, an activist, I guess until the day I die. So I want to thank you guys for this award. I really appreciate it. And hopefully more people will come out for peace rallies like Sally and Rashenda and I did. What was that, in September, Sally, or August? We went to Manhattan for a peace rally against nuclear weapons and banning everything and stopping, killing of young people of color throughout this world with weapons of mass destruction. That's what they are. So I thank you. I'm really appreciative, and I'm glad to be in the company of the mayor of Staten Island, Ms. Marjorie Garvin, Ms. Clara Ogburn. Ms. Clara Ogburn belongs to so many different organizations, but she's so involved in each and every one of them. Soji, I've known him since a young man, and I've always been impressed by him. Who did I miss?
Barbara, I think Barbara Walker.
Oh, Barbara hasn't come on yet. All right.
No,
Okay.
she's right.
All right, she's behind me. All right. So anyway, in conclusion, thank you guys. I really appreciate this, and I will try to live up to the honor of peace.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you. Well, our next awardee is Barbara Walker. By 1954, the year Barbara graduated from Hunter College, the war to end all wars, the peace to end all peace, World War II, Hiroshima, Yalta, Tehran, the formation of the United Nations promoted by China, Florence, Russia, United Kingdom, and the United States were major facts in my life and my contemporaries. For many of us, there was a rush of excitement. There were worlds outside the US to go to, not necessarily in a grand tour style, but there was the chance to be introduced abroad by student ocean liner rates, by hitchhiking, by summer courses for foreigners. The world was her oyster. Yes, for Barbara, traveling for work became a way of life. She went to UN posts in Africa and the Middle East. Her son David grew up in Ethiopia. Other posts included Namibia, Angola, and Jerusalem. For too much of the world, the government was allowed to exist, and it depended not only on the will of the people, but on the will of powerful nations and corporations who had a major interest in their geographic location, as well as resources that they sought to control. All of this Barbara saw firsthand. Barbara said, and I quote, "Needless to say, being selected for this honor is more than words can say. It is also unsettling. Why? Because all of us are doing this, encountering daily injustices wrought upon people around the world, and doing what we can to pressure national and international bodies for corrective action. Thank you, Peace Action. And thank you, Barbara, and for your work. The Peacemaker Award is presented to you for a lifetime following the path of a peacemaker at the United Nations, in her work in Africa and here at home, and for your passionate advocacy through speeches, letters, and bearing witness for peace and Palestinian rights. Congratulations, Barbara. This Peacemaker Award is presented to you today. Would you like to say a few words?
Woo, go Mom!
Barbara, you need to unmute.
Unmute.
Mom, lower left hand.
The host may be able to unmute her. If you click on the little, go to her screen, her window, and click on the three little dots there on the upper right-hand side, you can try to unmute.
We're able to ask her to unmute, but she has to press we're asking her to unmute. She needs to press the message.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. Great.
Eileen, thanks for speaking for me, things that I'd written and you said them, and I'm so pleased because I would really like to say a few words about one of the matters, and you alluded to it, the Israel-Palestine matter. Many, when one speaks of it, what you hear is, oh, they've been at it for 2,000 years. Well, that's just not the case. The United States and Israel are allies, and that is fine. The problem is what else has happened. The UN partition provided for 2 states. There are 2 states, but many of us don't know that there are 2. Many of us feel that there is only one. There's Israel, which was formed in 1948, and Palestine in 1988. Both of these were provided for by the UN partition in 1947. Israel, since June 1967 has illegally occupied Palestine. The US, however, has signed the UN resolution requiring Israel to end the occupation. Israel has not ended it. Israeli settlements are illegal. That's under the Geneva Convention. The United States recognizes the state of Israel. Israel is a UN member. The United States does not recognize the state of Palestine. Palestine is a UN observer, has UN observer status. Correction is needed. Obviously, the rights of Palestinians are not being observed, and it is up to us to really demand correction of this situation.
Thank you, Barbara. I know this is something that you're very passionate about, and to me, it seems like you work tirelessly on it. And thank you. Thank you for all you do.
Well,
thank you for
thank you.
And congratulations.
It's such a great injustice that all must work to rectify it.
Yes. Thank you for your work. Thank you to all our awardees. As we've listened to them today, as we've heard some of their accomplishments, they inspire us and they make us realize that so much is being done and so much more has to be done. So I want to thank everyone for being here today, and congratulations again to the awardees. And again, I think Vincent Intondi has left the event, but it was so wonderful to have him. I want to thank the board of Peace Action, Tatiana Agnello, Jack Bolenbach, Joanna Fredericks, Debbie and Dave Polshuk, Mohan, who has a second name, but I'm not I'm not going to try to pronounce it. I couldn't do it justice. And of course, Sally Jones. I want to thank the Make Food Not War Committee, Sally, Joanna, Jack, Mohan, Debbie, Dave. And I want to say welcome to one of our newest members, Brooke Krause, who has worked with us and has been a tremendous asset. The events that we are able to put on, the actions that we take, the lobbying or protests or whatever it is that we're doing, without the board, it wouldn't happen. And so I want to give heartfelt thanks to them. They are all, you need to know that they are very dedicated, hardworking, and I don't think they know the meaning of the word no. They just, whatever needs to be done, they do it. So thank you, thank you. So thank you everybody for being here today. And in conclusion, I would like to leave you with words of one of our awardees who we lost, Mike May. And he kind of coined the phrase, and it's something that we should all remember. Peace against action. And all of our awardees today have certainly proved that. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day, and we hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Oh, I have a question.
Thank you all.